Hello, hello. Welcome back to Staying in My Lane podcast. We have really dug deep into generational trauma, and thank you all for the feedback. This has been a really hot topic, and I've gotten a lot of messages from people about how they can relate to it and how they want to normalize it in their own lives. And this is the whole point of my podcast. I want to be relatable. I want you guys to be able to feel that you can relate to someone else, because these conversations that we are having and these topics that we are discussing can be really uncomfortable and awkward, or just might not even be normalized as a regular conversation that we would have, which goes back to why I created this podcast. We talk about the awkward topics and have those uncomfortable conversations with me so that you don't have to have it with someone else. You can just listen to me talk about things, and if you want to message me, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine. You don't have to tell anybody that you listened. So with that being said, we've talked about generational trauma, and if you have not listened, go back and listen to part 1 and 2. This is part 3, so let's get started. We talked about epigenetics in the first episode, and those are those patterns that can be passed down to children. So in simple terms, epigenetics studies how behaviors, experiences, and environment can change how your body reads DNA. But that doesn't change the DNA sequence itself. That just influences that gene activity. And that potentially can affect your health, whether it's mental, physical, emotional, later on. And so if we think about, and this is a true fact, a father's sperm can actually pass down his emotional regulation or dysregulation patterns, his trauma, and his experiences and how he responds to those experiences to his child through his sperm during that fertilization process with the mom. And then we think of the mom. When she is pregnant, whatever experiences that she goes through, how she responds to stress, what she's eating, what she's bringing in her life and putting into her body, all of that affects the child before they are even born. And like I said, this does not mean that you cannot change how you respond to things when you're older. This just means that those patterns are passed down through the fertilization process, and those are patterns that can be passed down through generation to generation. And so we think of things, for example, my children's favorite foods are whatever I craved and put in my body during pregnancy. So for one, it's chicken nuggets, for another, it's tacos, and for another one, it's steak. And those can be passed down through me when I was carrying my children. And so when you think about your children, what are their favorite foods? Are they something that you craved during pregnancy? Is it something that you really like to eat? Is it something that you were around a lot when you were pregnant? It's just really cool to think about that and think about how these things influence our children before they are even born. And so when we think about trauma, we look at transgenerational trauma, the passing of trauma effects across generation to generation that can lead to attachment disruptions. And this is affecting the parent's ability to form secure, healthy attachments, potentially leading to children inheriting those maladaptive coping mechanisms. And those are those unhealthy coping mechanisms and those stress responses. And so how does transgenerational trauma affect attachment? When parents are struggling with trauma or stress, they might resort to those unhealthy coping mechanisms, such as emotional dysregulation and arguing or withdrawing and isolating themselves. And then those are passed down to children, leading to their difficulties in forming attachment. As I just mentioned, emotional regulation. Trauma can disrupt an individual's ability to regulate their emotions, which can result in emotional outbursts or arguments, difficulty expressing those emotions, or just shutting down completely. And that can affect that parent-child relationship and that bond, which leads to an attachment disruption with the parent-child relationship. So when we are thinking of attachment patterns, These disrupted attachments can really create that cycle of trauma and attachment difficulties, and that is passed from generation to generation. So, for example, we've talked about anxious parents. We've talked about those moms who feel anxiety. So, when we look at an anxious, preoccupied attachment, children may be overly reliant on their caregivers for that reassurance or that validation and that they are doing it the right way due to the fear of abandonment or emotional unavailability. And so that is that anxious, preoccupied attachment. And we've talked about emotional unavailability, right? So that's that dismissive or avoidant attachment. Children may actually suppress their need for closeness and emotional expression and may even become overly independent due to a learned perception of being emotionally unavailable from a caregiver. And then we think of the fearful attachment, which occurs and emerges when a child's attachment figure is a source of both safety and threat. And that leads to a chaotic and unpredictable attachment. So the child will never know what to expect. If a parent says, "Oh, yeah, you're fine. Yes, you're safe," but then turns around and yells or physically hurts the child, that's going to create a fearful attachment where that safety sometimes is there, but in reality, they never know what to expect. So that leads to that unpredictable attachment relationship. And these disrupted attachments, like I said, can create a cycle of trauma and attachment difficulties. And that attachment trauma may occur in the form of basic interpersonal neglect. And so that's that omission trauma in the form of physical, mental, emotional, or sexual abuse, which is commission trauma. Transgenerational trauma passed from generation to generation is only through the process of attachment formation. And so these are those things that failure to recognize or respond to a child's needs results in an insecure attachment. And so that really is trauma. That trauma is resulting in an insecure attachment. And that disrupts their development and that disrupts their ability to form that emotional regulation pattern or that secure attachment. And like I said, this can result in difficulties expressing emotions, understanding those emotions, and forming healthy relationships in their future. And this can result in family members being less responsive or less supportive, which makes it hard for individuals to connect emotionally in a healthy way with their children, partners, or spouses. And like I talked about before, this can lead to that lack of self-worth, anxiety, that depersonalization or feeling detached from yourself or other people around you, emotional dysregulation, emotional unavailability, and impaired life skills. So those are those things like critical thinking skills, decision making, or even managing your time or ability to control your impulses. We've talked about emotional availability. So when your family ignores your concerns, or when you have a caregiver or a parent who is dismissive, that can lead to the feelings of isolation or invalidation and that sense of feeling unheard, which potentially damage or impacts our relationships in the future and our own well-being. So we are going to deep dive into a more detailed breakdown of the potential consequences of emotional dismissiveness or emotional unavailability. Feeling unheard and invalidated, that really goes back to those concerns and emotions that are not being acknowledged or taken seriously, leading to feelings of being unheard or feeling unimportant, which really goes back to the scapegoat or black sheep situation that Ashley mentioned in part 2. And that's something that I felt, and that's something that I've had to really learn to look at and change, is the fact that I was so unheard and just dismissed my entire time growing up because I was looked at as the immature cousin or the immature niece or nephew and, the only child, and she was so spoiled. And in reality, I was not. I was immature, but I was craving that relationship with my family, and I wanted that for so long. And now, being 34, I can kind of, just acknowledge that that probably will never happen. And that's okay because, that's just, I can't force anybody to. get to know me. I can't force that relationship. And we've talked about that. But the emotional and psychological impact on being dismissive of someone's feelings, that can really affect someone, and that can affect their well-being, and that can affect the family function, right? Increased anxiety and stress is another one, and that really is that constant feeling of being ignored, and that can contribute to the heightened anxiety and lead to stress levels, trying to find that resolution or understanding that you feel like you're never going to get. And, I've talked about that as well. I have tried to talk to family. I've tried to, I wanted for so long to be heard, and I wanted so long to feel validated or feel included. And that really led for me to anxiety. And that constant feeling of being ignored can really impact someone's self-esteem and their feelings of, feeling included. And when a family member constantly or consistently dismisses your concerns or, diminishes how you feel, that can really lower your self-esteem and make you feel like your opinions or feelings are not valued, or even that they're not real, which obviously leads into anger and resentment. That inability to communicate and be heard can lead to those feelings of anger or resentment towards your family members who are ignoring you, which I have definitely felt, I'm not going to lie. And it has made me feel so worthless and has hurt my feelings for so many years. And, it is what it is. I can't force anybody, but it really does affect someone's mental health. And that can lead to things like that damage to family relationships. That can create a strained family relationship, making it difficult to build trust and connection, or that breakdown of communication when family members are unwilling to address concerns or address that they did something to make you feel bad. That can lead to that breakdown and a lack of understanding, or a difficulty in resolving that conflict, which ignoring can prevent that open and honest communication. Something that I always talk about: open and honest communication about your problems, making it difficult to resolve those conflicts and find solutions or build on to those relationships if you are unable to have those conversations, or if they're just flat out ignoring you. That's not going to help solve any conflict or create or find any solutions. And that all circles back. It's all a big circle if you think about it, like a little merry-go-round. That all goes back to that generational trauma and breaking that cycle of abuse or trauma. And I just want to clarify, when I say the word abuse, that does not mean physical abuse. That can mean verbal or emotional damage or abuse. That can mean unhealthy conflicts or unhealthy patterns of behavior. But like I said, going back to this cycle of trauma, that is where generational trauma, you can stop that. You can create those boundaries and seek support from outside sources. You can change your diet. You can change your emotional regulation patterns. Or if it is coming from family, you can limit that contact with someone and consider limiting that contact with people who make you feel like they are constantly dismissing your feelings or your concerns, and really shifting that focus to that self-care and prioritizing your own family and engaging in activities and engaging with people who make you feel heard and make you feel seen and validated. And like I said, this all comes full circle back to that generational trauma, back to that generational cycle of what patterns and what things are being passed down to generation. Those dismissive feelings that you are feeling are going to be passed to your children. And if you don't find that balance, or if you don't figure out those boundaries, then your children are going to feel that dismissiveness and that feeling of being unheard or feeling of being not validated. When we think of family structures or family patterns, there is actually a plethora of family structures. What do you think of when you are thinking of your own family? What is the first thing that comes to your mind? The nuclear family is a traditional structure of parents that includes that biological or adoptive and their children. Extended family includes multiple generations, such as grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, living together or in close proximity to each other. A blended family is formed when parents remarry, resulting in children from previous relationships living together. A single parent family is children living with one parent either due to separation, death, or divorce of the other parent. And a beanpole family, which I had never really heard of before, is a family structure with vertical connections, such as parent, child, grandparent, but limited horizontal connections to aunts, uncles, and cousins. And this results in a family that is long and thin, stretching across generations. And the causes of beanpole families are longer lifespans. So people living longer means more generations living at the same time. Fewer children being born means fewer siblings in each generation. And that really is that fewer aunts, fewer uncles, fewer cousins. More importance is more placed on ties between those generations and how those patterns and those relationships are managed and built. Children may have better relationships with grandparents. And I actually kind of go back to my own family. I had really good relationships with my grandma and grandpa. On my mom's side, my grandma and grandpa on my dad's side, I was also close to, but the proximity as far as distance wise, we are not close in proximity, physical distance. The difference between a beanpole family versus an extended family is a vertical extended family refers to a family where multiple generations live together or very close to each other, whereas a beanpole family is a long, thin, extended family with multiple older generations but fewer children in each generation. And beanpole families can have effects on children in those families because the practical care arrangements in a beanpole family are more vulnerable to issues such as children and parents living distance-wise apart from each other, or consequences of divorce or family problems that arise in the family leading to conflict or emotional distance. Which I just thought it was really interesting to share that because that's something that I had really never heard of before researching for this episode. So when we think of generational trauma and that whole coming back to that full circle, back to that generational trauma, when we think of breaking that cycle, we need to really accept and acknowledge that trauma. And that doesn't necessarily mean, I'm going to go back to this because I think it's important. Acknowledging that something didn't work for you when you were a child or doesn't work for your family does not mean that you are disrespecting your family. That means that you are breaking patterns that might stem from those psychological effects on your life. And allow yourself to create a space to process and reflect and resolve that trauma, whether it's directly experienced or passed down to you and you've experienced by watching someone else. Take time to recognize the impact and allow yourself to freely acknowledge how those past experiences has affected the current generations and commit to breaking that cycle and allowing yourself to do so without feeling guilty. Even if you have to go to therapy or talk to somebody outside of your family, it's really important to find that support in other people and be able to accept without feeling that shame or guilt, which may take time, and that's okay. This conversation has really been meant to normalize these things. And, if you are feeling like maybe there's some trauma that has been passed down, or you want to really change the patterns that have been passed down through your family, this is meant to bring that education and informative discussion about this topic and really, honestly, to feel relatable. I want people to be able to relate to these topics that I talk about. And not every topic that I talk about I've had personal experience with, but this is one that I can say I've had experience with. I've vulnerably shared my personal experiences, and I've brought in a guest on who has been able to be vulnerable and share her personal experience as well. Like I said before, and I'm going to say one more time, these conversations are not meant to be offensive or disrespectful to anyone in my family or anyone else. These conversations are meant to be relatable. They are meant to bring awareness to topics that we don't always want to talk about. So I hope you find peace. I hope you find love. I hope you have patience and understanding with yourself. And I hope you can set those boundaries and really just live in peace with your life and your family. This has been a really fun little mini series of a topic that is really hot right now on TikTok and Facebook and probably Instagram, although I don't have Instagram. So I hope this conversation has been able to help you. I hope it's relatable. And if there are any other topics that you guys want to hear about in more depth, where we can have more conversations and more discussions on different episodes, let me know. So, with that being said, have a great day, and I will see you later. You can head over now to listen to part 4 of Generational Trauma, where I bring Ashley back. We deep dive into how it feels now for her to have shared her story and how closure and forgiveness looks, and just really get into a deeper conversation about that generational trauma. So I will see you guys on over there. Bye.